There are a few seats here. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with TED Talks, and we have adapted that model for today's discussion. And so we are pleased to bring you Grad Talks. To those of you who are joining us via the live stream, thank you for tuning in. And as a reminder, you can join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag Grad Initiative 2025. Graduation 2025 is the signature initiative of the largest and most diverse higher education system in this country. Across our campuses, we are all focused on improving the graduation rates for our students, which also helps in our efforts to remain accessible for new CSU hopeful students. But our success is not just measured in rates of graduation. More importantly, it is reflected in the meaning and impact that we are having on the lives of our students and their families. We know that achieving our student success goals won't be easy. It requires an investment and continual multi-year funding commitments. Out-of-the-box thinking, and in some cases may require us to blow up those boxes altogether. But it is worth doing. And as we seek to better serve and remove unintentional barriers that interfere with our students achieving their academic goals, it will ultimately contribute to our state's continual growth. Campus efforts are fully underway, and we are demonstrating great promise. We know that one size does not fit all 23 campuses, nor does a singular approach yield the same outcome for our diverse student population. Within our campuses, we are determining the most effective means for closing the gaps. Additionally, we have an inherent advantage over many other systems in that we have the opportunity to share and learn from each other. We should take great pride in our efforts to date, and what follows is a very small snapshot of the type of work on our campuses, which I've grouped into 4 broad categories. First are examples of efforts to improve student engagement and finding new ways to support and connect. Bakersfield's sensational sophomore program prepares freshmen to assume leadership roles in the sophomore year. Chico's REACH program with advising and peer and faculty mentoring yields higher persistence rates. Dominguez Hill's first-year experience program begins in the summer and strengthens students' connection with the institution. Fresno's Bulldog micro-retention grants and San Jose's Spartan completion grants assist students who are at risk of dropping out or being disenrolled for relatively small dollar balances. Monterey Bay's Reading Apprenticeship program is enabling the faculty to better engage students in discipline-specific problem solving. Northridge's Early Alert Pilot program provides students periodic updates on their progress in courses with high DFU grades, along with resources for improving their outcomes. Sacramento's Support Service for Underrepresented Students and San Marcos's Cougar Care Network are addressing students' needs through a holistic approach. And Sonoma has established a transfer and transition center to better support and engage new and continuing students. A second cluster of work underway is enhancing and expanding advising and mentoring. We have such examples as Channel Island's Channel Your Success campaign that engages mentors to connect with students on academic probation, and Humboldt State's RAMP program and place-based learning communities that are demonstrating the value of mentoring. The Maritime Academy's mandatory advising and integrated advising services are ensuring students have timely information to progress in their degree programs. Similarly, San Diego and San Francisco are redesigning the delivery and structure of advising. A third area of work involves employing data-driven strategies such as predictive analytics and early alerts. Our East Bay, Fullerton, Long Beach, and Stanislaus campuses are building data infrastructures to inform courses of action, creating early warning systems, forecasting courses needed, and engaging faculty in data analysis. The final area aims to increase institutional capacity by improving the knowledge base around student success and providing critical training for faculty and staff. For example, at Los Angeles, Pomona, San Bernardino, and San Luis Obispo, emphasis has been on engaging within departments and divisions and across the university to increase faculty and staff awareness of high-impact practices in areas such as college-level math, or combining offices and focusing on reducing redundancy and integrating academic support services campus-wide. Our multiple approaches are yielding results, and we are part of a national dialogue in higher education about student success. And this afternoon, we're fortunate to have 3 national leaders in higher education who are working in their respective organizations and across sectors to give voice to the compelling need to address the barriers that contribute to inequities in student outcomes and promote policies and strategies that achieve success. Their bios are in your program. So for the next 90 minutes, these leaders will invite us to think broader, think larger, more contextually and innovatively. I encourage us to consider the implications of their work in relation to what we are undertaking on our campuses to improve the student experience. Following their presentations, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, exchange ideas, and explore their work in greater depth. Our first speaker is Mr. Jim Larimore. He's the Chief Officer for the ACT Center for Equity in Learning, which focuses on forming partnerships aimed at improving college and career readiness. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Larimore.
Going to get rid of the big picture. So, Marawaka, Ohio gozaimasu. Howdy. My name is Jim Larimore. I wanted to greet you today in the languages of my family and my ancestors from the Comanche tribe of Oklahoma, from Japan, and from this little bunch of Scots-Irish settlers who in the 1800s found their way deep into the heart of Comanche country, not knowing what they'd gotten themselves into. I also want to acknowledge that having been raised as a Comanche man, that I'm very conscious today that I'm a visitor. I'm a guest here in the ancestral homelands of the Kumeyaay, the Cahuilla, Luiseño, and Digueño tribes. And just, while I can hardly see you all out in the crowd, I want to ask if there are any descendants of those tribal people here in the room today. Okay. I don't see. If you're here, please give me a shout out. The reason I ask this of you is that the way that I was raised, we recognize that when we're visiting the homelands of other people, that we should be respectful and that we should ask for permission to speak. So I'll assume that I have permission, having been invited here for this gathering. But I also wanted to provide a little bit of truth in advertising. So I think I was invited because of my official asset-based resume, which you can read about in my bio. I've had the good fortune to work now at ACT, developing the Center for Equity and Learning. I've previously been a deputy director on the post-secondary success team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I worked for a dozen years as a chief student affairs officer at schools in the U.S. and abroad, helping form the NYU campus in Abu Dhabi. My career started as the director for the American Indian program out at Stanford University, where I inherited a campus in 1985 that had become accustomed to a 50% dropout rate among Native American students. And these were some of the best and brightest kids that our tribes had to offer. And over the course of about 6 years, we brought almost to parity our completion rate. We got up to about 90%, was just a few percentage points below the university average. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things that we learned and some of the things that we did along the way. I also had the good fortune to be invited in on the team, the advisory group that created the Bill and Melinda Gates Millennium Scholars Program, which was an unbelievable opportunity to rethink what equity would look like if you took away financial challenges from the experience of first-generation low-income students of color as they headed off to college. But I wanted to tell you my unofficial story. So I told you a little bit about my family background. That's me, age 2. Cute kid, don't know what happened since then. My father was a career soldier in the Army. He was a 27-year enlisted man, left school in the 7th grade to go to work to help support his family and served in World War II. He was a part of the group in the 1st Cavalry that fought across the Pacific, helped liberate the Philippines. My dad was in the first group of people from the 1st Cavalry that went in to occupy Tokyo at the end of the war, where he met and married my mom, who came to the U.S. sight unseen, living in El Paso and Leavenworth, Kansas, as her first 2 places to live in the United States. And as I got to know my parents as I was growing up, I thought not only were they both bold, adventurous people, but my mom must have been mad crazy in love with my dad. No offense to El Paso or Leavenworth, Kansas, but it was a different journey for her. The gift that they gave to my brother and my 2 sisters and me was an assumption that we were going to college, while neither of them had the opportunity to do so in their own lives. My dad, out of necessity, going to work to help support his family. My mom, because opportunity at that point in Japan was really capped at the 12th grade for young women, no matter how bright or how hardworking they were. So they gave their children a different gift, a different kind of opportunity. And then one by one, each of us realized that when we arrived in college, we had no idea what to do. We had no idea how the places worked, how we'd navigate our way through that experience, how to access help if we needed it. We did it the hard way, and that had a formative impact on my life and my work as an educator. So the work for me is very personal, and you may hear that in some of the comments that I'll share with you today. This is also, I wanted to share with you, one of my favorite pieces of art. It's a piece called Him and Those Stars at Night by a guy named Sam English, who's an Ojibwe man. And what you might not realize in this picture is it's actually a visual form of prayer. There is a person calling upon their ancestors, sitting in front of a campfire in the evening. We believe that our people were singing at the very beginning of time, and that there's a vibration in the universe which carries the spirit of those who prayed for us to have the opportunity to have the life that we have. And you'll see in the wisps of smoke here going up into the stars, we believe that the smoke carries our prayers up to the heavens. The figures are little dancing figures, right? So our people, we recognize that we are part of something that is timeless, that we're connected in different ways to those who came before us. And so I mentioned when I greeted you in the languages of my family, this is also an overt ploy on my part to call the spirits of my ancestors to be with me here on stage, to back me up as we kind of talk with you about some other things. So we live in a country, I think this may look very much like a slide that Tim Rennick shared with you just a little while ago. We live in a country where, if we're brutally honest with ourselves, we have to recognize that talent and potential are pretty evenly distributed, but opportunity is not. So education is one of the ways that we can try to level the playing field or increase opportunities for educational attainment and social mobility. And this is just one of a number of different ways of depicting that information. This is another. So if you'll, it's a little bit busy as a slide, but if you'll focus over in the far left corner, what this slide shows is just looking at students who grow up, hit the birth lottery. They grow up in families in the highest quintile of income compared to students who grow up in families in the bottom quintile of income. In the 8th grade, 95% of students in both groups aspire to get a college education. But whether or not they actually have the opportunity and if they have the resources that will help them achieve their goals is a different story. By the time we get to high school graduation, What you'll see is that while we're doing an overall a better job of getting students through to graduation in high school, there's a gap. And importantly, when you take a look at what happens in the fall after graduation from high school, the gap explodes. The bottom falls out. Many of the students who aspire to go to college, who've met the requirements for graduating from high school, choose not or are not able to go on and begin their college studies in what we might consider kind of on time. If you follow this all the way off to the right edge, you'll see there's a 10x difference in the likelihood of completing a degree. And this is in the time frame. This is a data slide that we pulled together during my time at the Gates Foundation. So we were really looking at completion by age 26, because the likelihood of students completing after that point in their lives drops even more substantially. So when we look at this, we really see it as a map of kind of how the disparities present themselves. But the truth is that if you take a look at the experience of students going to college, we don't even provide the information that they might need to make better choices. So I'll pick, this is a large university system in another state. There are two campuses that are literally about 1 hour apart from each other on an interstate highway. They have basically very similar academic offerings. They enroll student bodies that are very, very similar in their composition. One school has about a 25% graduation rate, the other has about a 65% graduation rate. You won't find that on a website, you won't find it in a single bit of admissions information, and one of the challenges is then that we're leaving students in the position where they have to roll the dice about which campus they might enroll at. And then if you think about compounding academic transition issues or challenges, the debt that they would accumulate over that period of time, it's really a bit, as a first-gen graduate myself, I think it's a bit of a setup, right? And this is in a time where the public is expecting greater transparency and accountability from us. So as educators, I think the responsibility on us is to be bold, as you are here in California, and to really step up, right? To own the issues and to try to figure out what we do about them. This, a guy from ACT can't come out here without some ACT data slide. This is my favorite data slide from ACT. On the x-axis, one of the things you'll know is this is a breakout by ACT test score ranges. We score 0 through 36, from low to medium to high. On the y-axis, there's a measure of the goodness of fit between a student's interests and their field of study. So we have ways of assessing or measuring things like that. What you'll notice is that we've plotted the likelihood of persistence in the major, which is very highly correlated with persistence to completion. What I love about this slide as a former dean is that if you look at the two things that I've circled, students in the lowest set of test scores around academic readiness who have a high interest major fit persist at the same rate as students with high test scores in a low interest major fit. It says everything that you need to know about the importance of good advising, and also that likelihood of completion, while it's related to academic readiness is only part of the story. We say within ACT that we think many schools would be better, better off if they admitted hardworking average students than if they admit students who are academically well qualified, but that have other challenges or don't have a sense of direction or are not in a position really to accept mentoring or guidance for themselves. But I think as you all take a look at the things that you're doing, the questions that you're asking now I think are absolutely on track. There are some additional layers of information that might also be useful to you as you go along. So as an educator, you can read faster than I can tell the joke. One of the challenges that comes along in our world is thinking about the process of change, right? How we manage change. As a Comanche man, one of the first questions that I got when I showed up at Stanford, which is a place that was very proud of itself, not surprisingly, right? The dean of student affairs who hired me asked, well, what do you think about this place? And I said, well, it's a prestigious institution. I think there are big challenges here, especially as I thought about the students who I had come to try to help get through to completion. And I said, and there's a fundamental difference as well in terms of worldview that kind of has to be addressed. I said, so the table that I turned on him was to ask the question of, in what society does it make good sense to raise people up to be the adults that you count on in your world by sending them off to live among themselves between the ages of 18 and 22, right? Taking them away from exposure to the very young and the very old and asking them to figure it out. So I think that one of the things that I bring from my personal background is that I ask a different set of questions when I start, right? So in some ways, I think of this as the difference between the things that we have inherited and the things that we choose to carry forward with us. And I think many of the practices and policies and procedures that we have in higher ed, they were created at a different point in time for a different group of students to accomplish certain ends. And if we're really honest in looking at it, what we know is that the system is perfectly well suited to produce the same crappy results year after year after year. So if we want a different result, if we want to reach a different set of outcomes, we really have to think differently about what it is that we're willing to do along the way. In my thinking, this means taking a look at new ways of imagining the world, creating diversity in the collections of people that are coming together, engaging students in the conversation to really think about how people experience things that we have taken for granted, right? That we simply choose to carry forward with us. I think Tim in his keynote address gave some wonderful examples and insights from Georgia State to that end. But I'll say that with this, one of the pieces of information or kind of input that you might consider, if you haven't already, maybe I'll ask by a show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Todd Rose, the educational researcher at Harvard who's written about the myth of average? Okay, a few of you. So I would just encourage you to check out his TED Talk. Todd pointed out that in the 1950s, after World War II had ended, as the U.S. Air Force was shifting to the use of jet planes, they were having terrible experiences with many jets crashing, causing a loss of human life, very talented pilots losing their lives, and millions of dollars of military equipment being destroyed in the process. When I heard Todd's description of this, I thought, this sounds just like higher education. The Air Force wondered what was going on. They blamed the plane manufacturers. The plane manufacturers blamed the pilots. When they found that the pilots were actually pretty good at flying the old planes, they blamed the instructors. You might know where this is going. And over time, what they found was that they had actually just poorly designed the cockpits. The cockpits were non-adjustable. They were built for the average pilot. They had 10 different physical measurements: height, wingspan or arm reach, length of legs, length of torso, all sorts of different things. And they built a cockpit for the average pilot, a pilot who was average across all 10 different physical dimensions. And when an enterprising young person, we would probably call a data analyst now, looked at that information and then looked at the physical measurements of the actual human pilots, what they found was that the average was a perfect match for 0 pilots. When you think about how we approach instruction or how our institutions were initially put together, many of them were built for average students, and students who are no longer the average may never have in fact been the average. So I think there are some examples that we can draw from other fields that might actually help you as you're getting other people on board with the difficult work of change on your campuses. When I won't belabor this, but I'd say that there are organizations now, I think Cal State as a system is certainly one of them, that are taking a different look at what information we have on our students. We're thinking differently about disaggregating data, about doing a deep dive look at different population segments within our student body. There are things that we then have to ask about fields of study, course plans, whether the public transportation system operates at hours that are in sync with the academic schedule or not, whether your students are experiencing housing or food insecurity, and what that means for their attendance or attentiveness when they're in the classroom. They're just a different set of questions that we need to become accustomed to asking. And that is because if we really want to get at addressing equity issues, we can't start with a mindset that tells us that everything is equal, that all students are equal, that all of them have an experience that is roughly equivalent, because the truth is they don't have that experience, right? We have to think about who they are, And I think engaging students directly is a key part of addressing this. The final thing that I'll say here is that I think that while you had the good fortune to hear Tim Rennick, who's an absolutely incredible professional, a real visionary in the field, Cal State is in a very unique position to actually lead the country, to think about this on a statewide kind of system level. The rest of us will be paying attention to what you're doing to see what we can learn from you, and you should know that you're not alone in the work. This is just a 2 minutes worth of grabbing logos from a number of organizations that are working on equity and social emotional learning, that are looking at ways that you can prepare teachers who are working in your feeder high schools to help students be better prepared for the college experience when they show up on your campuses, different researchers that are working on interventions, kind of large and small scale interventions that help with the onboarding experience of new students. And the center that I lead at ACT is working with many of these different organizations. So I think with the couple seconds that I have left, I want to maybe follow the lead of James Weiner by saying that I'll end where I started, simply by saying for the opportunity to join you all here today, Domar Argatu and Uta, excuse me. Thanks.
Thank you, Jim. We all know that California State University is the most ethnically, economically, and academically diverse four-year institution in the nation. The student body we serve truly reflects the diversity that makes California and increasingly the nation strong. 21 of our campuses have been federally designated as Hispanic-serving institutions, and some 2/3 of bachelor's degrees earned by Latinos or Latinas in this state are earned at the CSU. Our diversity is a particular point of pride for the CSU. It strengthens the college experience for students, faculty, and staff alike. But it also comes with a responsibility that we do not leave these students or any of our students behind when it comes to success and earning a degree. It is a responsibility we take seriously, and why one of the critical goals of Graduation Initiative 2025 is closing equity and achievement gaps. To talk more about the importance of research and data in monitoring equity gaps and highlighting national trends, please join me in welcoming senior writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education, Goldie Blumenstick.
And hi, everybody. Good afternoon. So in my day job, I spend a lot of time writing about innovation and what passes for innovation in higher education these days. And it's a job that sort of gives me a lot of opportunity to be exposed to a lot of acronyms and a lot of buzzwords. I'm sort of like the circa 2005 version of Toys R Us for buzzwords. I was thinking about what I was going to talk about a little bit today, and I was kind of going over all the buzzwords I could and topics I could have hit. So these are all the trends that are sort of bubbling out there that I encounter. I'll just throw a few at you here. CBE, competency-based education. You have all heard of that one. The whole credentials movement, alternative credentials, stackable credentials. The whole movement towards adult students. We've got this, the curriculum that aligns to employers. We've got the whole notion of project-based learning. We've got experiential learning. We've got the role of AI in education, and Lord help us, MOOCs. So I'm not talking about any of those today. But I did come up with a few, thank you, I got applause from the front here, Tim. There are 5 themes that I did want to talk about today that I think are very important to our discussion. And the reason I picked these 5 is, frankly, these trends are a little less trendy than some of the other trends that are out there. But I think that they actually have a lot of potential, currently or in the future, to really have an impact on what happens to students on our campuses. And if we can hit that slide, we'll go. All right, so one slide. And I'm going to just start and sort of walk you all through why I think these things matter. Data disaggregated to measure equity. What do I mean by that? Well, we all know the higher education system, it's not really a system. The college student body, it's not really a student body. It's a lot of student bodies, all in one. In our populations on your campuses and on the campuses that I visit, there are students that are older than other students. There are students that are poorer than other students. There are students that are less prepared than other students. And there are students of different racial and ethnic groups. But if you don't look at that every day and sort of evaluate what's happening on your campuses by starting to identify students by some of these categories, you're really missing a lot of what's happening on your campuses. So it's the old phrase, right? If you don't measure it, you don't know it. And if you're not measuring it, you're just getting an average and you're not really understanding what's happening out there. And I think we're starting to see in higher education, this is not a mega trend, this is maybe like a bubbling trend. I think we're starting to see a lot more attention to the value of measuring student data by a lot more subcategories. And it's revealing and it's important. Think about this. In California, it's one of the most, probably has the most Latino students, most Latino population in the country, right? But when it comes to equity gaps in between Latinos and white students, or white educated adults, California, unfortunately, is a leader in that. It has the biggest gap in Latino college attainment. Nationally, the figures for college attainment for white adults, it's 47%, associate's degree and above. For black adults, 31%. For Latinos, it's 22%. Why do I know that? I know that because the Education Trust told me that in a report. And they also told me more than that. They explained to me when I was doing some reporting earlier this year that income doesn't really tell the whole story. It doesn't explain all the differences. And we're all very comfortable in higher education talking about Pell eligible versus non-Pell eligible. And Lord, we better keep doing that because it's a really important measurement, but it's not enough. You have to think about your students in a lot of different contexts. And this applies not just to racial and ethnic differences, but also to adult students. If you want to serve veterans better, you have to start measuring what's happening to your veteran students. If you want to be serving transfer students better, you've got to be measuring what's happening to transfer students. And I will be the first to admit this is a really dicey proposition, particularly, frankly, in this current political environment. There's a lot of people out there who are willing to seize on differences, based especially by race and ethnicity, and use it to their own advantages, and in many cases to their own nefarious advantages. I think you have to be prepared to still use these measures and look at them, but also be ready to sort of stand up to whatever flack might come at you when you do them, because if you ignore them, you're sort of overlooking real challenges in your situations. Trend number 2, metrics that reflect social mobility. How many in this room have heard of the name Raj Chetty? Raise your hands. And out there on the live stream, you could raise your hand at your desk. That's great. How many of you heard of the reports that they do, the Equality of Opportunity Project that Raj Chetty and his colleagues are doing? Okay, there's a few hands up here, and I can see the hands out there on the live stream. And how many of you are familiar with the mobility report cards that the Equality of Opportunity? Well, that's good. This is one of these trends that I can't say is high and in the forefront of what's happening in American higher education, but I think it's a trend that is really burgeoning out there. These are studies that these researchers and others are doing that sort of talk about how colleges can increase social mobility. Not just colleges that take students from the upper class and then send them into the upper class. They evaluate colleges based on whether they're doing a good job in taking students from the lowest quartiles of income, in this case income, and how many of those students end up when they're in their 30s being in the highest quartile of income. It's fascinating work. You can find it on the web. I encourage you to go look it up. And here at Cal State, if you go look it up in Cal State, you'll have some reason to be happy, because 3 of the top 20 schools for social mobility are Cal State campuses. I'm going to call you out. Cal State LA, Cal Poly, and Cal State Northridge. So give yourself a hand. But don't get too smug, because CUNY has 9 campuses on that list. So if you want to get into sort of a competitive ranking, which is really what I do want you to do, and I'm starting to think that a lot more higher education is starting to do that. Start thinking about social mobility as one of those things that really is a distinguisher for you, and that you should be bragging about it. You should be becoming one of those engines of social mobility, and then you should be bragging about it. And I'm not arguing that social mobility is the new black in college rankings. US News and some of these other places are still obviously looking at a lot of other measures. But the discussion is changing. You can see it in the way places like the New York Times have started to promote this work. Even U.S. News itself has made some changes in it. Washington Monthly has been looking at these measures for quite a while. And I think social mobility is this sort of bubbling notion out there that could really change the nature of higher ed. And the reason I'm saying that is just look at some of the U.S. News rankings. And frankly, I've been having some discussions with folks at foundations, and they themselves are also talking a lot more about trying to elevate social mobility as a measure in higher ed. OER, as a force for affordability. I think you're all very comfortable. How many of you on your campuses here in the room at least are using open educational resources for some of your courses? That's good. I know California's got some Cal State's got some initiatives going right now with a company called VitalSource, I guess, and there's some other opportunities as well. What's fascinating to me about this open educational resources movement is that it has been a growing movement probably for the last 5 or 10 years. There's a real infrastructure that is developing around open educational resources. I'm going to name check some companies here, not because I'm promoting them, but because I think they really reflect that there's a dynamic at work. Lumen Learning, OpenStax, a company called Top Hat, VitalSource. These companies were not around about probably 10 years ago. These companies wouldn't have existed in the landscape. The way students got their books was because they got them from traditional publishers. The open educational resources movement is changing the dynamic of how students get their courses. And it's a force for affordability in a really significant way. A recent study just came out from Achieving the Dream, which has a big project going on right now with community colleges, and they found that students saved anywhere between $66 and $121 per course because their colleges were using open educational resources. It's a force for better outcomes in education. There was a recent, I'm like all about the studies right now. There was a recent study done by the University of Georgia that came out that looked at what happens to students who are using open educational resources in their classrooms, and they found better educational outcomes. Fewer students from, in this case, lower income backgrounds, fewer students from lower income backgrounds were withdrawing from classes or failing classes when they had the open educational resources being used. The biggest reason, of course, is that they had the book. They had the book when the class started, and that's what this really allows. It makes a huge difference. And frankly, they're a force for changing the publishing industry. I mentioned these companies that are sort of new and sort of changing the landscape. A lot of you have been hearing, some of you have been hearing at least, this new phrase, inclusive access. You're starting to see publishers trying to offer this as some of their alternatives to what they're doing right now. The publishing industry was not moved that did not do a lot of change for like 100 years. Suddenly, the publishing industry is recognizing it's not just the open educational resources movement, it's the textbook rental movement, it's the students not buying the books at all, but you're starting to see a real change in the business models from some of the publishers, and that's having an impact. Okay, this next one I'm calling individualized. It's not the same as personalized. I think you all heard this great talk by Tim Rennick, and the stuff that Georgia State's been doing is really amazing. And really, thanks to big data, colleges and professors know a lot more about their students than they've ever known before. We've got advising systems right now that'll help make sure students register for the classes for their majors. We've got chatbots that are helping stave off summer melt, as Tim demonstrated in the room. We've got course materials, smart textbooks, some of them open, some of them not. Smart textbooks that will individualize the instruction for every student in the class could have their own little pathway as they go through the course. The textbooks will respond to them and give them, it'll give them the exercises and the explanations that they need for their course of study. But, and there's a big but to all this, as fascinating as all this big data stuff is, there are still a lot of really big ethical issues, privacy issues, and ethic issues surrounding the big data movement, and I don't think colleges have begun to grapple with these issues at all. And frankly, I mean, it's not just me saying that, it's a lot of experts in the field who are saying that. If your campus is using these systems, what's your privacy policy? And do students know what the privacy policy is? And do the faculty know what the privacy policy is? How transparent are you? What kind of opt-in, opt-out is there in these for some of these systems for your students? And it's not just a theoretical question, because these systems are coming along right now, and they're really sort of changing the dynamic. Frankly, right now in Cal State, there's an experiment going on right now at Cal State San Diego, Cal State Sacramento, which I wrote about a few weeks ago, where they're using this, when you log into the network on your phone, and there's a lot of cell phone towers all around. At Cal State, they can track where you are right now, well, based on where your phone is. And there's a company that's working with Cal State Sacramento right now to sort of understand what happens to students when, are students in the library more? Then what happens, are these students doing better in their courses because they spent more time in the library? It's really cool. It is also really weird and a little bit creepy because suddenly there's all this cell phone information that people are following you around based on your cell phone. I have no doubt that it can be used to improve educational effectiveness on the campuses. I also have no doubt that it has the potential for a lot of shady activity if it's not used in the right hands. And so the bottom line of all that is not that you shouldn't do it, but that you should do it with careful and with a lot of information for your campuses. The other part of that is, I think these individualized textbooks and all these data systems, they're great. It's great that the systems know who you are and where, they know sort of where, the systems know where you've been and what you've done. But how many of you had a great professor when you were in college and you're still, or maybe even a great advisor, and you still remember that person today? Raise your hand. I mean, just about everyone's hands in the room, and hopefully you've all put your hand at home. Mine was a Shakespeare professor, even though I was not the greatest student of Shakespeare. That really makes a difference, and I've been out of college for a lot of years, and she's still a very important part of my memories of college and what I cared about. And I'm not making these numbers up. It's not just information by anecdote. Surveys by Gallup will tell you the same thing. Students who had a mentor or someone who cared about them when they were in college go on later on in life to report having sort of better career success and to have a better feeling about their own colleges. Apps do not inspire. People inspire. Their stories inspire. Their passions inspire. So as powerful as all these apps and technologies are, they're not enough. Finally, this notion of the embedded for-profit, which I kind of invented the term. I've taken a little flack for it, and it's a little more abstract than some of these other ones, but run with me on this one a little bit. How many of you heard of, know what the OPM is, an online program manager? These are companies like 2U, academic partnerships. They help help your colleges put your online programs out into the marketplace if you don't have the internal capacity. There's also a lot of companies out there that are doing student coaching. There are companies out there that are working with employers and advising students, helping students who work for employers to enroll in your college, and then they advise them on what courses they should be taking as they're enrolling in your sort of employer-sponsored educational programs. It's a fascinating new field. There's all this sort of new energy out there in the world of companies doing jobs on campus. But this is very non-traditional outsourcing. It's not outsourcing the cafeteria. The companies that are doing this are touching much closer to the academic core than outsourcing kind of companies used to ever before. That matters. I'm not really convinced in most places that the college governance systems are prepared for this, that the administrations are really understanding sort of the impact of this, and frankly, whether the faculty governance really understands all this. It's not like it's a nefarious evil thing, or it doesn't have to be. It's just a really new and different thing, and if colleges are not really kind of understanding this new role where other kinds of companies with, frankly, different missions, different financial interests are becoming embedded into the enterprise, sharing in your revenues, and in many cases maybe shaping the direction of when you offer your course, how you market the course. All of those things have an impact on the academic profile of your institution. And none of it's bad, but if you don't really understand it and you don't monitor it, then you're sort of abdicating something, and I would argue that these are not issues that should be abdicated. The lines are blurring, the business models are changing, and the models are becoming a little bit more hybridized. What was a for-profit, what was a nonprofit, they're different now, and just if you're not aware of those things, you're sort of missing the boat on this. I think that's my time. I will put one more last plug in. I said I spent a lot of time covering innovation. I do this, one of the ways I do this is with this newsletter for the Chronicle every Tuesday. It's called Relearning. It's not the greatest name, I will admit, but we sort of see it as a conversation between me and you out there too. It's free in your mailbox every Tuesday, and find me later on or tweet at me, and if you're interested in it, I'll send you information. If you're not already getting it, I will be happy to include you in the morning conversation, and hopefully we can continue this conversation, not just on the chairs here, but throughout the next few years. Thanks very much.
As an aside, my faculty and staff and students wouldn't forgive me if I didn't just note that when she referred to the social mobility of the three campuses, Northridge and LA, it was Cal Poly Pomona. So just want to note that. You know, thinking and acting innovatively has been the main theme throughout this session. And indeed, it is a main theme in the graduation initiative. But it is equally important that the innovative actions we take are backed by research or data, indicating that they will have a demonstrable impact on student success. Innovation for innovation's sake is not effective, nor is it productive. That is why data-driven decision-making is one of the 6 pillars of the graduation initiative. We are focused on advancing the programs, initiatives, and processes that work and rethinking those that don't. Our final speaker, Ryan Smith, is the former executive director of the Education Trust West, an organization focused on closing opportunity gaps for students of color and those from low-income families. And he's been newly named the Chief External Officer for the LAUSD. He brings a no-excuse proposition that we can achieve the desired results. Please join me in welcoming Ryan Smith.
All right, well, good afternoon. First of all, I just want to take a minute and celebrate the success over the last couple of years with this initiative and the work that you're doing to close equity gaps. Give yourselves a round of applause. It's fantastic to see equity champions in the room. I will say this, and I have a lot of slides and not a lot of time. I will say, given the state of the critical consciousness of this country, given the political landscape, we have to have a direct conversation about what equity really means. What is the imperative, both moral and social and economic imperative of equity? I'll talk a little bit more about why equity is the new coconut water. I'm sure you already have an inkling of what that may mean. So it was Julian Bond who really understood education, given that his father was the president of a Tennessee college campus. He said, violence is black children going to school for 12 years and receiving 6 years worth of education. When we talk about education equity, if you're not having critical, crucial conversations about how race and gender and power and privilege play out in our systems, if we're not talking about systemic institutional racism, I would ask you, are you having a conversation about equity? Now, I started off as a student organizer when I was 15, so I like to start with students. I know there's a number of student leaders from the CSU system in the room, so I'm just gonna holler at you guys, continue doing good work. But I'm also gonna think of an amazing student named Jaime Ramirez Mendoza. He grew up in Smith Valley, the community of Smith Valley, which is really, really close to the Oregon border. His parents were farm workers. They had never graduated high school, never stepped foot on a college campus, but believed their child could be something great. So even though he didn't go to all of the best schools, they always woke up every day before he went to school and said, we believe that you're actually college material. You can go to college. So much so that he went to junior high school and said, I need teachers who believe that I can go to college. And they said, what do you mean by that? Do you believe I can go to college? If not, you should not be teaching me. He continued this along this path, ended up becoming the first person in his family to go on to college. He went to UC Davis, majoring in Chicano and Chicano studies and economics, graduated, became a peer advisor, and met me and said, hey, I want to go to graduate school. Which graduate school? I heard you know stuff. Which graduate school should I go to? Here is my list. And I said, well, have you thought about UCLA? And he says, I'd never get into UCLA. I said, they would be lucky to have you. And then I said, have you thought about Harvard? He said, Harvard? I'd never even been to the East Coast. They would never accept someone like me. I said, not only would they probably accept you, you belong at a campus like Harvard. Well, I have good news that this fall he started at Harvard University at the Graduate School of Education. And this is the beginning of his research journey. He's actually wants to study how we can improve success rates, particularly of Latino young men, which is really important given that only 10% of Latino young men attain BAs in this country. And he says this about his story. Beyond affording me social mobility and fulfilling mi familia's dream of college degree, education has afforded me the privilege of having the influence of my destiny. Right? So that systems of power don't make my experience, but that as a bilingual, first-generation, low-income, proud Latino male, I'm able to make my experience in this American society. Jaime's story reminds us that it is not our students who need reforming, it's our systems. And the data that we see is often an indictment of that. So equity is the new coconut water. I often like to say it's the trend we're all talking about, but not everybody is drinking. It feels more like it's become a badge. Oh, if I can talk equity talk, then I must be doing the work. But let's think about this. Equity, how many of us have actually seen this picture? This is an important picture. Most people, when I ask educators, have you talked about equity? They're like, yeah, I know equity. Define it. Oh, you know that picture of the fence and the people and their different heights. You know, equity. So I think, first of all, it's powerful that this is the grounding visual for equity. But I will say this, there's problems with this. Number one, all of our students are amazingly brilliant. So the idea that they would be different heights, given the amounts of brilliance and talents they have, is wrong. What's the issue is that damn gate is built higher in some places than it is in others. It's about the system we've built. Also, I'll say this, if equity is about sitting outside and watching a baseball game for the rest of our lives, I don't want to be a part of it. Equity is about having enough money so that you can buy you and your family tickets to see the Dodgers win the World Series. Equity is about power, about transformational change. So we have to talk about results. A good definition I like to think about is equity means recognizing historical and systemic disparities in opportunities and outcomes and providing the resources necessary to address those outcomes. Equity is about results. It can't just stay at the recognition of disparities. So how are we doing? I will say this, in the country we have seen 30 years of progress, right? We see college-going rates up for all race and ethnicities. I'm gonna go through these really quickly. We also see college-going rates up for all income groups. They're increasing, that's exciting. We see graduation rates up for Black and Latino students at both the CSUs and UCs. That is exciting, that needs to be applauded. However, since 1980, California has built how many prisons? 22 prisons. How many universities? 4 public universities, 1 UC Merced. I will say this, it's interesting because hopefully we've read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. We talk about how the criminal justice system was created to mass incarcerate Black and brown bodies. But when we talk about education, we don't have a similar new Jim Crow. But I will say this is an example of, number one, where we put our money is where we're really investing, right? But number two, that in our systems, unfortunately, they've been created to undereducate and sometimes not educate at all Black and brown and poor people. And we need to face up to that as people who generally care about the system but know that it's flawed. When we think about some of the data, we see that low-income students today are still not reaching the college-going rates of high-income students in the 1970s. We see that Black and Latino American Indian freshmen complete college at lower rates than other students. Right? And we heard this earlier, white attainment rates are twice that of African Americans, almost 3 times that of Latinos. And what about in California? Why equity matters. 3 out of 5 students are low income. 3 out of 5 students are Black or Latino. 1 out of 5 students are English learners. We often call these groups what? We'll call them either underrepresented, we call them minorities, we call them subgroups in K-12. But in California, these are the groups of students. So if you're not having a conversation about equity, if that conversation is on the periphery, I would ask you, how are you going to change the system? This is where the conversation needs to start. Not on the periphery, on the sideline, but in the middle of how we change our systems. So I think about this. This is the Staples Center, right? Well, think about this. The number of California Black Latino students who don't graduate their cohort could fill the Staples Center more than 3 times. We know that college campus demographics aren't representative of high school demographics, even with all of our hard work. We've seen this data around college graduation rates for underserved students of color. Now, I put this up because we have to talk about policies, beliefs, but also practices as well. But the beliefs piece, how many of us have seen Hidden Figures? If you've not seen Hidden Figures, I'm silently judging you. I will just say that. I don't know how you work in education and not seen this movie. It's been out for 3 years. So, but one thing I will say to catch those up on the plot, these are brilliant African-American women who grew up in the Deep South during the 1960s, battled both sexism and racism, graduated from amazingly historically Black colleges, went on to NASA to become what? What was their occupations? Computers, human computers. They were calculating the launching and landing trajectories of the men that will ultimately go to the moon. If this can be done in 1968, you can't tell me our children cannot do math in 2018. You just cannot tell me that. But there's a belief gap about who can do math, who should be in our campuses, who should be enrolled in our physics classes, who should be science majors. And we know that gaps begin before school. And we know that part of this is K-12. And we know we've made decisions in K-12 as well. These are choices we've made, though, right? When we think about the K-12 system, we know that A through G courses for CSU and UC eligibility are lacking, particularly for low-income students. We know that there's less access to support staff for these students as well. But I'll also say in higher education, we also make decisions that unfortunately provide barriers for our students. When we look at the CSU average tuition, it has not risen up. Financially, it has not risen up to average tuition. We know that continues in our system. But then when we factor in cost of living, we really see how this limits access, particularly for our low-income students. This is what we hear from our students. So EdTrust West did an amazing report called Hear My Voice around how we support students, particularly low-income men of color, K through college. And through the qualitative study, we asked in focus groups what young men saw, and here are some of their responses, and you can read those responses. But the interesting thing is when we talk to faculty, they say, oh, of course we're supporting young men of color. So what are you specifically doing for young men of color? Well, we're doing all this other stuff, and of course young men of color will benefit from it. What specifically are you doing targeted to young men of color? Well, here's the number to somebody else, right? So a lot of the students recognize that, are we targeting the supports for the student demographics that have challenges? Or are we just universally saying we're doing all this wonderful work and of course students of color and low-income students will benefit? When I think about this also, universities need to incorporate a retention program to make sure you stay here. Life can hit you and they shouldn't babysit us. I'm glad they recognize that. But they should make sure they're doing everything in their power to help us have a successful college career. I will say this, resoundingly the students said, resoundingly, my college is trying to teach me how to navigate this system rather than meeting me where I am at. Changing the system so that it meets me where I am at. So what can we do? A lot of Americans have decided that we can't do too much. There's conventional wisdom. We have to fix poverty. Some of our students aren't college material. But we could choose differently, particularly in this room. Really thinking about how we change results to be good results. Now, when we think about San Diego Unified, and I will say this, if you're not creating dynamic partnerships with your high schools in your respective communities, you have to wonder if you're really thinking about how you can change the system writ large. But we know San Diego Unified moved from A through G as a default series, and we see the bumps in success rates because of that. San Diego State University started to really analyze data. They looked at course pathways, course bottlenecks. They thought about their policies and practices. In 10 years, Latino grad rate went up from 31% to 60%. And that should be applauded. And the former president said, a great university doesn't lose almost 2/3 of its Latino freshmen along the road to graduation. We heard a little bit about this before, but even in our own research at Trust West, we've seen the impact of summer bridge programs across all of the systems and what that can do to ensure that students are successful. And as someone who did a summer bridge program, I can say it is important. It was certainly important to my success. And then when we talk about black students, particularly if you saw that piece in the New York Times about Charlottesville and the historical disparities that, of black students, which is really amazing. We often talk about how to support African American students given some of the graduation gaps, but we've seen at UC Santa Barbara that they're closing gaps by targeting not only students, making sure they're checking in, but really thinking more dynamically about how they engage their students across the number of years, and they've seen almost a 10% jump in black students graduating. So bottom line is what we do matters and that it can be done. I'm gonna end here. So Bayard Rustin, how many of us know Bayard Rustin? I'm not silently judging this time if you don't know Bayard Rustin, but Bayard Rustin was a community organizer in the 1960s. He actually found Martin Luther King and said, you should help lead the civil rights movement. He felt like he was unable to do that because he was a gay out man in the 1960s, and he was the architect of the March on Washington. He said, we need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. President Coley alluded to the idea of disruption. I would say this, if you are not disrupting the system, a system that's been built over decades to ensure that many of our students do not graduate, then what are we doing? It's not enough to call yourself an equity champion. You have to bring more people along than the people in this room. You must disrupt the system. And I will say, I hope over the next 2 days as you guys do this conference, that you'll think about yourselves as being angelic troublemakers, particularly because educators don't always like the troublemaker title. But this is the good troublemaking, the troublemaking that actually will close equity gaps in 2025. And with that, I'm done. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And now I would like to invite our other speakers back to the stage, where we're going to give you an opportunity to explore some of the points made, to ask questions. And so please join me in giving our three speakers a round of applause. We have two individuals in the audience who have microphones, and I think they're turning up the light so I can see. Great. While you are, just raise your hand if you have a question. In the meantime, I'm going to get started. Let me just start with you, Ryan. You noted that there are choices institutions are making that create greater hindrances for students of color and low income. Please expand on that theme.
Yeah, and I think my colleagues' presentations also explored this theme as well. I oftentimes, in conferences like this, a lot of the talk, when you start to go, well, where are these obstacles coming from, you start to see this outside the room. Okay, well, let's talk about poverty. Let's talk about parents. Let's talk about that. And those things are important. But we know that there are beliefs, policies, and practices that happen both in K-12 and in higher education that absolutely discourage and put barriers in front of students. We know that it's great to see that we're actually tackling remediation in this state, given the history of how remedial programs have unfortunately disadvantaged many low-income students and students of color. We know that oftentimes the way that we talk about who belongs on our campuses and who doesn't belong on our campuses and who belongs in this lecture has a challenge, a barrier connected to it. When we thought about Hear My Voice, the Education Trust West report, we often heard that students, many students who probably would have dropped out, were so happy when they found a retention program or they found a counselor who said, this is how you navigate this system, a system that felt so complex and so different to them, and said, I wish there was another way that could have come to me in the beginning, my first week. I know a student in particular who went to Stanford, and he said, I almost dropped out my first week because everyone had their classes. I didn't know how they got their classes. And I just wandered around the campus for an entire week thinking I must be too dumb to come to this school. So we have to think differently about how we support, particularly our first-generation students, particularly students of color.
Great.
Yeah.
Jim, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on it. And I'll borrow from two different kind of fields. So one, I think as a sociologist, I think part of this is we have to pay attention to things that people now describe as between social bonding capital, the kind of solidarity or support you get from within a group. And then I think especially for those of us who are first-gen students or those who are working with first-gen students, there's also social bridging capital, right? So how do you make it your business to point things out, to expose the unwritten rules, to connect people with resources in a way that allows them then to really kind of pursue their own potential, right? So there's that. The other is, I'll tell you, so it was, I'm not Catholic. I grew up with a lot of Catholic friends. And one of the things that I loved about some of the discussions I had with them as teenagers, and I won't get into the backstory on this, was the distinction between sins of omission and sins of commission, right? And I think we have both in higher ed, and we need to start kind of talking about it. What is it that we do that puts some students off or that sends signals that, I think the campuses where I worked were notorious for poor signage. So if you don't belong here, we're not going to help you learn your way here. Right, and there are kind of those subtle messages, and then there are things that I think that we have to steer away from certain things and move towards certain things. And I think if we exercise our intelligence and a sense of empathy, and put ourselves in the shoes of students or walk with students as they're making sense of things, I think we can actually cover an awful lot of ground fairly quickly.
I'm really glad that you just said something about signage, because as I've been thinking about this, and I've been fielding an inquiry in the back of the room by someone saying, oh, can you come talk about college costs? And because I've been thinking every improvement to student success does not actually have to be shouldn't have to be a cost too. There have to be ways of doing this with smarter training, and it's not always add a new department, because then you sort of become self-defeating. You've added more services, but you've added more costs that makes it harder for people to come.
Right. Questions? Here in the center, President Morales. We need to use the mic because of us live streaming, so that individuals joining us can hear.
Let me thank all three of you for a great presentation, and I don't know where to start, but I know that in the region that I work every day, tracking is alive and well. And I say that on a very personal level because I was tracked into non-academic programs as a middle school child in the South Bronx. And so the solution to tracking is making the A through G curriculum the default curriculum throughout California, as San Diego Unified School District has done. And I know that Dale Marsden is piloting that effort in, I believe, 3 of the 5 high schools in San Bernardino. But this is what we need to work towards, to ensuring that high school students take 4 years of math, and to ensure that we raise the expectations. No child rises to low expectations, and by making the A through G curriculum the default curriculum in public education throughout California will help increase the A through G completion rates. Thank you so much.
I did some reporting here about 6 or 8 years ago during the financial crisis in California, and I remember talking to some students, and I was not from California, so I was not familiar with the A to G until I had come out here, and then I was talking to a lot of these high school students who were on their way to college. And ever since then, I've been wondering, why doesn't every state have that? It's like, because a lot of states, students don't know how to prepare for college. The ACT studies say that all the time. Students aren't taking the right classes. And I always thought it was sort of a, somewhat of genius that California just has this curriculum, and at least all the college-going kids knew what it was. If you're saying all the other students don't know what it is, then it's obviously a problem. But you are a step ahead of a lot of states.
Yeah, I'll say this. First of all, President Morales, I commend you for a couple of things. One, I know that you've done some serious investment in bridge programs, and I think both the district, San Bernardino Unified, and you cover the cost for summer bridge programs, particularly for young men, if I remember that correctly, from our research. So I commend you for that, and I commend you on saying that A through G is really important. I will say this. There's often a focus on access, and I think that's important. I absolutely, and my organization has supported, or HS West has supported A through G for All for a very long time. I will say, when you start to look at access versus success, we really have to start having that conversation as well, because we know that there are many students who are enrolled in A through G classes with teachers who have either been unprepared to teach them or not supported very well, and that has to change too. I also want to say, and I'm going to put some pressure, because we're in a room with higher education leaders, that we have to think differently about what happens in K-12. What are we doing differently in higher ed to actually receive those students? Perfect example, we know that California's had Common Core at least adopted over the last 10 years. Given that there's a new set of standards that almost all the students now that are coming to your universities have been exposed to and have worked with, how are you thinking differently about that? Mm-hmm. If we went through A through G default, what would you be doing differently, right? And you have more of a connection and foundation there, but I often hear this is what K-12 needs to do, and I know that's not what you're saying, President, because I know you work very closely with your local unified school district, but how are you thinking differently given some of the policy changes and practices that are happening in K-12 to think about how instruction is different in college? How are we building better bridges between K-12 and higher ed? I think that's essential when we're talking about issues of equity.
Yeah.
Jim, you want to comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll warn you, I could talk about this all day, right? So I think, as Ryan is pointing out, I think one of the traps that we sometimes fall into is we'll start to divide things up, and we'll say, so here's what we do in K-12, or here's what we do in post-secondary, and then we'll subdivide that into 2- and 4-year institutions without really thinking about the connections or the bridges that are necessary to have alignment across those systems. So, and within California, I think the Cal State campuses, many of you are working with community colleges and with your local school districts. And I think what that helps to do is to say that when you graduate from high school, we know that almost all of you are going to need 1, 2, or 4 years of post-secondary education to move in the direction that you want career-wise. And we're going to smooth out the system so that you are able to make those transitions and to then make decisions along the way. If you went into a 1-year program and you decide that you want to complete a 2-year program or transfer onto a 4-year program, you should be able to do that, right? But what it requires is not thinking about the segments or sectors as separate things that people then have to somehow navigate on their own, but really thinking about the total system or the ecosystem that those institutions exist within.
And there's a challenge to that. I mean, at the federal level and at the state level, there's different budget bills, there's different funding mechanisms. A lot of this follows the money, and the Higher Education Act is different than ESSA, and so people will respond to different triggers.
Sure, but at the same time, your students, while they're in high school, so you can project back to the high schools what students need to do in order to be ready to be successful when they're in post-secondary. Many of your students are arriving and they've had dual enrollment or concurrent enrollment classes, or they've been in AP, right? So I think higher ed's voices kind of combined with leaders in the K-12 sector is absolutely essential moving forward.
Yeah, actually, this dual enrollment could be the thing that really sort of changes its dynamic a lot. I mean, it probably is only happening at certain kinds of high schools, and to the tracking issue for certain kinds of students, but it's one of the few bridges that we have between the two systems right now.
And there's a big risk on the horizon with this around career and technical education, and a desire to kind of beef up or revitalize CTE in high schools. Some of the people that are involved in that work see that as a way to sort students out at an early age, and to think about which students are most appropriate, or
Yeah.
which channel might be the best one, and I think you have to blow that up.
I go to a lot of these conferences where there's a lot of discussion about not everybody needs to go to college, but somehow it always seems to be for other people's children.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Another question?
So,
Chancellor White, do we have a microphone here?
It sounds like they have a microphone in the back. Oh, they took it away. Frank?
So in some respects, thank you. Let me say thank you, and then in some respects.
Yes, Sam.
Words matter and their order. Just even talking about post-secondary education, DICE is up. Why don't we talk about educating California?
Yep.
P2P, preschool to PhD, right? Adam Day, the chairman of our board, and I sit on a education leaders roundtable, along with Janet Napolitano and George Kiefer from the UC, and the folks from the community college, and K through 12, the superintendent of instruction is there, private colleges and universities. And we've been meeting for about a year, talking about this very issue, about how do we not look out for our own piece of the pie, but think about educating California with all of the beauty of the mosaic of our challenges and opportunities here. So I'm actually encouraged by those conversations because it's the first time in people's lives here where you have everybody at the table and we've left our credentials at the door.
What happens when the budget gets put on the table, though, when those people, do the divisions start to happen a little bit more?
As long as the Cal State gets its money, it's okay. Well, I mean, I do think it does tie into the infrastructure of financing of public education, and every state has its own set of infrastructures. We have one where there's Prop 98 and Prop 13, and you go back over time, and so there's certain segments that are algorithm-driven, but there's others that are in the discretionary budget. And in California's overall budget, a little less than 10% of the entire state budget is discretionary. And within that, 60% of it is the UC and the CSU and the community colleges and the Cal Grant program. So when, I don't know if there's a technical term you use when something hits the fan, but it is only
unfamiliar
this
with it, yeah.
portion of the budget that suffers. And what we have that others don't have is the tuition aspect. And so resources do get differentiated when the economy is robust, and they get differentiated especially when the economy contracts. And resources matter because that's the people capital that touch our students and do the work that we're talking about in addition to everything else. But I just wanted to say that I think there is a different level of conversation occurring now, and hope springs eternal in our business.
And I think probably your students and your students' families don't wake up every morning understanding these differences. They just know they have, they or their children want to get educated and go through the system.
They want to go to school.
Yeah.
Right? How about Trustee Hinton, our student trustee? She had a question.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of the presentations. Specifically, I think it's really important when we talk about equity in higher education. And my question for either of the three of you is when we're talking about equity, oftentimes some of the conversations we have, the response that I hear is, well, that's not necessarily our responsibility to fulfill. That's the state's responsibility, or that's because some of the barriers that students face often extend beyond our institutions of higher education and become institutional systems of oppression just in our nation. And so as far as like food and housing insecurity, basic needs for students, and having a more holistic approach to education in higher education systems, I'm wondering what your response is to some of the responses I hear of, well, if we provide a specific resource for this group of students, then next this group is going to want that resource, and then this group's going to want that resource, and where does it stop, and whose responsibility is what? That's often a response I hear.
Go ahead.
Just really quickly, I will say this, because I don't think we always have a truthful conversation about equity, because oftentimes I think it's masked by sometimes talking about race, other things. Equity is about power at the end of the day, right? And the idea around equity is that we have to shift power that's traditionally been in one place to another place in order to close gaps. So yes, when someone says, well, there are some groups that may not benefit as much as others, I'm like, that's the point, right? Because there's some groups that have always benefited that we need to actually think differently about. And this is where the rubber hits the road. It's about resources. Who gets what? Because everybody loves equity until you start talking about resources.
Right.
Oh yeah, I'm all for equity, but don't take mine away from me, right? And I guess the other thing I would say, because you're a brilliant student leader, is why don't we talk about things that we actually have the power to think about differently? One of the things, the Campaign for College Opportunity did an amazing study around faculty diversity, something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. But I will be truthful, if you're having equity conversations and you don't have people of color or women or people who are queer in the room, you should question if you're really having a conversation around equity. You can't say that you care about the demographic when you are not hiring people who look like the demographic that you're serving. We can actually do something about that. That is not an issue of food insecurity or housing security. That's an issue of the decisions we've made in this system, and it's a hard one to have, but we can have that conversation. So I would just remind people of what we can do within the system.
I was going to add, if I could have added a sixth trend, it would have been sort of this focus on food insecurity and housing insecurity. I think it's a small movement again, maybe a micro trend out there, but I think there's an organization called the Hope Lab out in Philadelphia that's pushing this, sort of professors who are putting statements on their syllabi now that say things like, if you're experiencing hunger or a food issue or a housing issue, please let me know as a professor. So I think that's starting to spread a little bit to the professoriate, but then to go back and quote President Obama, vote. I mean, if these are issues that affect students, students need to make their voices heard, and if they're not making their voices heard, as Ryan said, political leaders will respond to the voices that they do hear from.
Right. Yeah.
Jim, did you want to add something?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because I think some of this is that, so we have these systems, right? And as I mentioned during my comments, we have inherited a set of systems. I think, within the academy, like we took the entire world of knowledge and different ways of knowing, and for our convenience, we divided it up into the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. That didn't fall from the sky, right? We created that. It's a construct. And I think the same thing applies when we think about students who are experiencing, whether it's basic needs insecurity or there are complications, so that if you qualify for financial aid at a certain level, you may lose your SNAP benefits or you may be disqualified for other things. Those are all rooted in systems that we created to meet a particular need, and the systems don't link and they don't align. So I think when I kind of come at this, not to tell my Comanche dad, when I was at too young an age to have this word in my vocabulary, he just looked at me and said, "Man, you are a total instigator." And I thought, okay, well, what is that? And he explained it, and I said, okay, I'm good. And I think, we have to take some responsibility to say that if the systems don't align, then who convenes the conversation, right? Who makes it their job to say, I'm going to step out of my lane to bring people together because my students are suffering. My community is not being served. Right. We pay taxes. These are systems in our government that are supposed to be helping support us and providing that bridge so that we can get to where we want to go. And I think that, we have to take on the responsibility of being the instigators, being the positive troublemakers. We have to use our voice, and we have to do it effectively. And to go back to the Chancellor's comments, I think that in higher education, we're also in a really privileged position to be the convener, right? To say these are issues you can look at on a state level, you can look at them on a regional or local level, to say, you know what, I talk to business leaders. I want to bring them to the table. Because these are barriers that not only affect students in taking and passing the courses, these are barriers to getting people to fill jobs. Employers should care about this. Financial institutions should care about this. The state should care about it. And we have to figure out, you know, how do we create the narrative? How do we leverage our relationship authority and convening authority to try to do some good in the world?
Wonderful. Another question. Here's the mic and, oh, it's over here.
Hi, I'm Thomas Parham from Cal State University, Dominguez Hills. So first of all, let me echo my colleagues and say thank you for the panel and the comments. It's been informative. I'm reminded in your conversation about a New York Times article in 2014 that asked a question about who gets to graduate. It was a story about the Vanessa Brewers of the world. And among the characteristics that she was there, beyond being a brilliant student, was the fact that she was a first-generation student who then experienced academic difficulty for the first time when she got to the University of Texas. And when she called home to mom, which was the most stark fact, the only thing that mom could share with her was, well, child, maybe college just ain't for you. Why don't you come on home? It really underscored really what that first-gen piece was about. But it also reminded me that the success, particularly for African-American folk, and I believe for our Latino brothers and sisters as well, is that historically it's always been connected to a triangle where the home, the school, and the community, including the church, were all singing from the same sheet of music. The angles of or the dimensions, I should say, exist these days. The angles aren't connected up because everybody blames the other for the failure of our children. Home thinks school's the problem. School thinks home's the problem. The community thinks both are the problem. So everybody's developing intervention strategies in absence of consultation with the other two dimensions of the triangle. My question is, how do we, one, reconnect up the triangle so that we broaden the ecosystem beyond just the educational domain, but we get into the home and we get into the communities to develop those strategic partners? And how do we then work with the home and the parents and other folk to teach them how to best contribute to the intellectual and personal growth and development of their students?
You've talked a lot about bridge programs. It seems like that's a piece of
I'll
it,
also
right?
say I've done a lot of parent engagement work. So a couple of things. One, how many of you guys have had conversations around the need to build partnerships with parents in order to move this work? That's good. I mean, I will say this. I often find the conversation that institutions have around parent engagement to be stifling, like a challenging conversation. Number one, because it's always kind of deficit-oriented. Well, these parents don't, they have 2 jobs, they can't do this. And as if, you know, show me the research that shows that white parents are way more engaged in going to every event compared to low-income parents. Because I think that's a myth that we've allowed to continue. I will say this. I think we have to think institutionally, what is the role for parents in higher education outside of just coming to an orientation in the beginning of the year? Is there a role particularly for first-generation students, particularly for low-income students, particularly students of color, underrepresented students, that could be different? I know that CSU's done some amazing work outreaching to African-American churches in order to recruit more black students. That's exciting. Can you build upon that to really think about how you engage more black families normally? Are there other opportunities and touch points throughout the year to really encourage communication between the university and parents as well? I just think, how do you think of both, not only just your parents, but the community writ large as being partners in the work? But I will say this, if you're waiting for parents to come to you, you're gonna have it's gonna be a long time, it's gonna be a long wait.
You know, I'm sitting here thinking about a conversation I had a few months ago with Nicole Hurd, who runs the National College Advising Corps. It's kind of a Teach for America, but for advisors. She was describing to me about how a lot of their advisors, their relationships are with their students, but their relationships are also with the students' parents, and that in a lot of ways, these advisors can talk to the parents in a way more easily. You know, the parents are much more willing to tell the advisor the challenges about filling out the FAFSA than they are willing to tell their own children about it, because there are some things about it that are embarrassing. So I feel like there are roles for these organizations, these third-party organizations can really play a bridging role in and engaging parents a lot more, and there aren't enough of them, but obviously to take advantage of the ones that do exist, Avid, NCAN, some of these others that are out there.
Yeah, and I would say in different communities too, you need to think in a multi-generational or intergenerational way, right? So I know that seeing I told you a little bit about my parents. They brainwashed us basically to have an expectation that we would go to college after high school, and we stumbled along our way. What I recognized when I saw my mom with her her grandchildren was that she had upped her game based on what she had learned from her own children. So she would talk to my nieces and nephews, and then my children about, when you go to college, what do you think you might want to study, or what kind of place might you want to do? And they would come up with some kind of an answer in this conversation with Grandma, and then she'd say, how about grad school? What about grad school? And there was this kind of social bridging, kind of transfer of social capital thing going on. I think in the work that we do, I would just kind of put a pin in this as like an exploratory piece of the work that you're doing. Try some things. Pay really careful attention to the dynamic, to the discussion. And I think you'd probably have to toggle back and forth between two levels. And I'll describe this: narrative and action. Right? On the action side of it, yeah, you can bring people together, and you can, I would say, this is a problem at ACT in a very, we have more PhDs per capita than the University of Iowa. Very nerdy place full of professional skeptics. We have footnotes on everything, right? But I think when you're going out and engaging with parents, you should lead with questions. Invite people into the conversation, right? Don't ask them, do you have any questions? Ask them, what questions
Tacit
do you
knowledge,
have? Right?
respect the tacit knowledge.
Yeah, and I think you can look at ways to build coalitions or kind of, learn together as you go. But the other is, I think, around defining reality, right? I think that there is this piece that we have to engage parents and grandparents or others in the community and create a new narrative. Because I think, to pick on the media, I think we have sometimes I think in the news media in general, we get things kind of parroted back that are carefully crafted talking points or message points that someone has come up with for a reason. So I think there are reasons why we started to hear more things about blaming the schools, blaming teachers. It was basically to break up teacher unions, right? There were issues and they've just seeped into the mainstream way of thinking about things. Higher ed is under assault, right? There are challenges about public trust in higher education. That's a narrative. That I think is a reflection of some reality, but it's also been amped up and put on steroids, right? And I think we have to think of what's the counter narrative? What's the story that we want to tell? How do we want to engage people in thinking about these issues? And I think we have to focus then on the action. How do we get to results? The results are going to speak more than the political spin and talking points.
I agree. The last quick things I'll just remember: who's responsible for family engagement on your campuses, and do you know who that is? And are they involved in the equity conversation? And then lastly, the model that I think is the best model in California around family engagement are extended learning programs. If you go to after-school programs and you see relationships that they have, particularly around their students' academic achievement, it's pretty profound, it's comprehensive. Like, how do we take from that model and think about how that actually can apply for higher ed as well?
Wonderful. Well, I know that we could certainly continue this dialogue, and we do have another session following this, but I want you to join me in giving a round of applause to these outstanding. Thank you so much. We really appreciate this, and I am pleased now to have Executive Vice Chancellor Lauren Blanchard come to the stage.